Hey, what's going on, guys? Rago here from Kite. So I'm just here in our demo room with Tucker, and when I got in today, I saw that there was some snow on the ground, which is kind of nice because we were thinking about sneaking out and getting a snow kite session in and taking you guys along. But we did have a thaw recently, and it got me thinking about those warmer spring sessions. And a lot of you probably don't know this, but when I first started here, Tucker kind of took me under his wing and showed me how great the dawn sessions could be here in Michigan. And I learned a lot about kiteboarding back in those days, just getting out. And funny enough, Tucker here was always on the 14 FX, while the only kites that I could make work were the 17 Contra and the 17 Turbine.
Yeah, the FX is a kite I've always liked. It's got great feel, freestyle performance without going as far as a sea kite. It's so limited in wind range. It really allows you to get upwind and shed power when you want to. On those days when you want to go and hook, have that premium kite when you learn those new tricks. In terms of the Contra, I ride the Contra a lot too when it's light. I prefer the FX over the Contra for unhooking, but on those lighter days, sometimes you got to go with the Contra. There comes a point where you just got to jump onto a bigger bird.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything Tucker just said there. And truth be told, I ride the FX now because Tucker introduced me to it. But I still love the Contra and the Turbine. And this week I thought it would be fun to do a lightwind kite video, so we're going to do the Contra versus the Turbine. Let's get to it. Lightwind kites have come a long way in the last 5 years. So if you're not getting out there in those sub 15 mile per hour days, you're really missing out. And this spring, I'll make a point to take you guys along, and we'll go get some sessions in with Tucker, and we'll just sneak out of here. So this week, we're breaking down two of the longest standing lightwind kites that we have here in the shop: the Cabrinha Contra versus the Slingshot Turbine. They're both built with the same purpose and rider in mind, but they do have some pretty distinct differences. So let's start with the Contra. There are a few things that come to mind on just why I love this kite. And it's probably the kite that I put the most time in while working here. In fact, a lot of the videos that you see of myself riding are actually on the 17 Contra here. With its 3-strut construction, this kite's incredibly lightweight, allowing for it to fly in some really light wind for its size. And for a large kite, it actually has a surprisingly fast turning speed, particularly the 15 meter. It's moderate but not overbearing. The relaunch is consistent and reliable. So what about the Turbine? Well, it's not as lightweight as the Contra. What it lacks there, it makes up for in durability and low end. So meaning that with the Turbine, pound for pound, you're going to get out in less wind in the kite's respective wind range. More on that later. The trade-off here is that with a lightweight construction, the Contra will actually work in less wind and you can sign the kite with less effort. So something to consider if you love pushing the bottom end on those light wind days. As far as a park and go kite when you're not pushing the bottom end of the light winds, the Turbine's going to have more power. So an important note here is that the Turbine does have more low end, but you will get overpowered on that kite quicker than you will on the Contra. So to give you some perspective here, I've taken the 17 Contra out, I think in as much as about 25 miles per hour, and that was definitely pushing it. I don't advocate that by any means. So it's important to note that the Turbine does have more low end than the Contra, but you're going to get overpowered more quickly on the Turbine. I find myself just getting dragged downwind. It gets a bit harder to jump with the kite, so it just really loses some of its efficacy when the wind does get stronger. So what about the bar pressure on these two kites? I've talked about bar pressure a couple times now and how it can be a pretty subjective thing, and it comes down to whether you prefer light bar pressure or heavier bar pressure. And I find that the Turbine definitely has heavier bar pressure than the Contra, and I think part of that comes down to that perceived power. And that's actually something that I do like about the Turbine, is when you are riding in that light wind, it does have more low end, but also just that feeling, that bar pressure, creating that sensation of more low end is also satisfying, when you're riding on those lighter days, and it does make a difference. And as for the Contra, I wouldn't say that it has light bar pressure by any means, definitely more moderate bar pressure. But it is, a faster, lighter, more playful feeling kite than the Turbine. And a large part of that has to do with the aspect ratios of these two kites. So another point to consider between these two kites is the relaunch. And I often make a point to not really address relaunch in a lot of these videos because, truth be told, with most modern kites, relaunch really isn't that big of a deal anymore. But on the light wind days, it does become much more critical, especially on those spring days where you get those thermal winds. And I'm sure some of you have noticed this before when you're out sessioning and there's next to no wind on the surface of the water, but maybe 15 meters up, it's a nice steady breeze and you can actually get out and ride. But as soon as you drop that kite, it's game over. You know, between these two kites, I want to say that the Contra does have a little bit relaunch, but to give you some perspective here as well, I've actually dropped Ep14 Turbine in a wind shadow at our local slick, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how easily that kite popped back up. And a fun little trick with high aspect ratio kites like the Turbine is, you know, if you do find yourself in a bind where it doesn't want to relaunch, all you have to do is swim at the kite, get it to flip onto its back, and then pull on one of the lines, and it's going to relaunch just as easy as any other kite on any other day. And this trick isn't something you're going to necessarily have to do on the Turbine. It's just something to be mindful of when you're in the lightest of light winds. And truth be told, between these two kites, you know, I'm not 100% certain which one actually has the better relaunch in lighter winds. We had a little bit of a debate with some of the guys here at the shop, and the general consensus is the Contra is just marginally better. But you know, there's a handful of guys here that would say that the Turbine does relaunch better. So I'm not certain on this one myself. You know, I've definitely relaunched both of them numerous times. Personally, I think the Contra is a touch easier, but I do see where they're getting at. So the takeaway here is, you know, the Contra, it probably does relaunch a bit easier in normal conditions, but I do think that it's a bit easier to get the Turbine to roll on its back when you're in the really, really marginal winds. So maybe there's a slight advantage there, but it's still debatable. So anybody out there who flies these two kites, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Chime in, let us know your experience in relaunching the Turbine and the Contra, and just let us know what you think. So with all that said, with there being a bit of a debate between these two kites, you know, let's do a poll. Let's have you know, the riders out there who ride the Contra and riders who ride the Turbine. Let us know about your experience. What have you noticed about these two kites when you're riding them in those threshold winds and you drop it? Do you find the relaunch to be easy, or you know, maybe a little more difficult? And do you have any tips or tricks for anybody out there for that light wind relaunch? So what about the construction on these kites? And I touched on this a little bit earlier. So the Contra, you know, it is a little bit lighter. They've reduced some of the materials, lightweight design. The Turbine, it's a bit more heavy duty. You know, and with that said, you can really get the Contra out there and work it more. So while the Turbine does have more low end, you know, the Contra, it's really light, it's playful. You know, you can really sign that kite pretty effortlessly. And don't let the light material scare you, because I've been using this kite 3 years in a row, and I've really put it through the ringer. And I'm yet to experience any problems with, you know, dropping it and crashing it and, you know, beating it up, just like I would advocate you to beat up any other kite that you're riding. You know, make sure you're dropping that kite, make sure you're progressing and having fun, and don't sweat it. So don't let the reduced material scare you. The Contra is still super durable, but it does have a little more advantage getting out in those threshold winds with that lighter construction. So moving on to the fun stuff, let's talk about jumping. So I'll tell you right now, hands down, that the Turbine, it is a better jumper than the Contra. And a large part of this is because it's a higher aspect ratio kite. So what that means is it's going to be loftier, it's going to jump easier, you're going to get a lot more hang time out of it. And I know that's a really important point for a lot of people. And you know, like I said, I actually often opt for the Contra myself, and the reason being here is while it doesn't jump quite as well as the Turbine, it is a more well-rounded kite. So if you actually look at the canopies of this kite, you can actually almost see what a kite is capable of just by looking at the shape. You know, and so what I find is while the Turbine does jump better, the Contra is a bit more well-rounded for those riders who like to on-hook or do freestyle in the lighter winds. You know, if you like to get into the waves, I think it's a faster, more playful kite. You know, the Turbine is very much a park and go kite. It has that old school feel. It pulls like a truck, real heavy duty. It rocks you upwind. It jumps well. But the Contra, on the other hand, you know, it doesn't pull quite as hard like a truck. It's a more lighter, more playful, more well-rounded kite. Don't get me wrong, because the Contra, it jumps really well. It's still, you know, your standard issue performance all-around freeride kite. So all the things that you've come to love about kites like this, you know, whether it's the Switchblade or the Evo or the Envy, or, you know, any of those characteristics that you've just come to expect from those all-around kites, the Contra really embodies a lot of that. The key point to take away here is they're just different, you know. One's higher aspect ratio, one not so much. So one's going to jump a little better, but one's going to be a little more well-rounded. So it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a personal preference here between these two kites. So what about the upwind ability? Well, again, actually the Turbine, for the same reason, because of its shape and where it sits in the wind window, it sits a bit further forward in the wind window, and what that does is it makes for a kite that does ride upwind a little bit better. But you know, the big trade-off to consider here, I suppose, is, so the Contra, it's actually going to be a more stable kite, while the Turbine, you know, it's going to feel rock steady because of its heavier weight and that truck-like pull. but when the wind gets inconsistent, it does become a little less stable than the Contra. And conversely, while it does ride upwind better, you know, the Contra does have a larger wind range, so you can work the Contra in less wind, and like I mentioned earlier, you can get the Contra out in more wind. So what happens is when you do get pinned on the turbine, you pretty much lose all that efficacy, and then you're going to be able to ride upwind better on the Contra. So there's definite trade-offs here. So, you know, in the average wind range for the turbine, it's going to ride upwind better. And when you get overpowered or underpowered, I would say that the Contra is actually going to ride upwind a little bit better. So to recap on these two kites, these are two of my go-to kites. I put a lot of time in on both of these. I don't have any real strong preferences. I gravitate towards the Contra, again, simply because it's usually more often available in our demo area, so I put a lot more time in on that one. But I would certainly pick either one of these, and just to give you a quick recap, you know, the Contra, it's more lightweight, a little bit better relaunch, more playful, more well-rounded kite. You're gonna have a slight edge with this kite when you get a little bit overpowered or a little bit underpowered. And you know, back to the turbine, you're gonna get a more heavy-duty construction, a more truck-like pull. It does jump a little bit better. It does ride upwind a little bit better. So, you know, there's just a few differences to really consider between these kites, and there's no wrong choice here. It's totally personal preference and what you want to get out of your kite. So when it comes to deciding which one of these two kites is right for you, just, you know, ask yourself a few questions. What do you want to get out of your kite, and what trade-offs are most important to you that we covered in this video? So hey guys, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. It really does help me make more of these videos. And as well, you know, I would love to hear your feedback on lightwind kites. So let me know what your favorite lightwind kites are. Tell us, you know, what you like about them. Tell us what you don't like about them as well. You know, it's all about the pros and cons here. And hey, if you're curious to learn more about lightwind kites or any other kites, I'm going to actually include a link in the description to both of these kites, and as well at the end of this video. So if you want to learn more about the turbine or the Contra, just click on those and you can get a little bit more. And until next time, this has been Rago, and I will see you next Wednesday.